Welcome to another edition of Eye on the Issues. Today we are talking nuclear energy. We're talking with Gordon Edwards. He is the president and co-founder of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. Gordon, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me. And let's begin by talking a little bit about your background. Now, you got a PhD. Tell us a little bit more about who you are.
Well, actually, I was going to go into nuclear science originally. From high school, I was told that nuclear power is clean, safe, and renewable. And I thought, wow, that's great. And I found out later when I graduated from university with a gold medal in mathematics and physics that those adjectives are not true. That, in fact, for the first 30 years of the nuclear age, all of the decision makers and the public were misled into thinking there was no waste problem with nuclear power, that there was no such thing as nuclear waste. I was shocked myself when I found out that in 3 different states in the United States, there were millions of gallons of high-level liquid waste. They had no permanent solution for it. This was a shock to me because we had been led to believe that it was a genuinely clean technology. When this came to light in the mid-70s, there were reports in both Canada, the United Kingdom, and USA blowing the whistle on nuclear power and saying, hey, you haven't solved the problem. This is a serious problem. And if you don't solve the problem, there will be no more nuclear reactors built. So at that point, the nuclear industry quickly said, oh, yes, that's true. We forgot to mention it, but we do have a solution, and the solution is deep burial. Well, now we've discovered that the only 3 repositories that currently are used for deep burial of radioactive waste of a lesser kind are leaking and have suffered accidents. And so now people are not as sure as they were before that burying this stuff underground is going to do the trick.
Now, I had mentioned that in Wyoming, the state legislature, which is meeting right now, has 2 bills before it. One is not getting out of committee, and that is HB 16, but SF 186, Senate File 186, is about fuel storage. And so the people in Wyoming really need to get educated. The lawmakers need to get educated. And that's why I'm talking to you today. And before we go into what your thoughts are on that, let's kind of take a left turn, if we can, at Albuquerque and talk for a second about your live debate on TV. I believe it was in 1964 about nuclear energy against Edward Teller, the founder of the hydrogen bomb. Can you tell us how that was?
It was 1974. And it was, yes, it was an interesting debate. The subject matter was resolve that nuclear power is necessary and should continue to be deployed. And the result was that at the outset, they took a vote of the audience. 70% were in favor of that proposition. And by the end of the debate, 70% were against it. And Edward Teller was quite upset. He said to me, the wrong side has won. But all I did was point out to people that they had been misled, that they were told that it was clean. It's not clean. The radioactive waste that is produced by nuclear power is the most toxic waste produced by any industry ever. And also it's indestructible for millions of years. And it poses a problem for thousands of future generations. Number 2 is that if you have an accident, and whether this is an accident of a commercial kind or a military attack, for example, all those radioactive poisons that are manufactured inside the reactor will be released to the environment. And as Sir Brian Flowers, a nuclear physicist from the United Kingdom, said back in 1976, if nuclear power had been deployed in Europe before World War II, then large parts of Europe would be uninhabitable today because of nuclear power, because of World War II, because those plants would have undoubtedly been targeted. And when they're blown up, all the contents are released, and you have what's even worse than a meltdown, because a meltdown only releases about 5% of the radioactivity inside. That kind of military attack would release the entire contents.
Now, you put out a video, I believe it's called Nuclear Waste 101. Can you kind of give us a little insight into the scientifics of where does nuclear waste come from? How does the process work?
Yeah, that's the mystifying part of it. Most people don't understand. They say, well, all operations have waste of some kind. So what's the difference? It's just garbage. You sweep it up and you put it into a bin and take it somewhere and problem over. The difficulty with nuclear waste is that you are splitting uranium atoms and releasing a nuclear power. Remember that a single uranium bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, destroyed an entire city. Where does all that energy come from? It turns out the energy comes from the splitting of uranium atoms, and that's what happens inside a nuclear reactor. Now, it doesn't happen in an explosive way, but it produces the same kind of garbage that a nuclear explosion does. And these are called the fission products. They're the broken pieces of uranium atoms. And these broken pieces of uranium atoms, there's hundreds of varieties of them, and they are virtually indestructible except through the process of natural radioactive decay. The heat generated by this radioactive waste that is automatically created is so great that even after the reactor is completely shut down, the heat from the radioactivity alone is enough to melt the entire reactor into the ground. And that's what happened at Fukushima. Those Fukushima reactors that melted down, the three of them in 2011, they were all safely shut down after the earthquake and the tsunami. They were all safely shut down. It was only the radioactivity inside the core of the reactor that had to be cooled. That's what the radioactive waste is. Now, to put it in another context, the US Geological Survey published a report in 1978. This is around the time when nuclear waste was first identified as a serious long-term problem to the human race. They pointed out that all the waste from the nuclear reactors in the United States of America, if you wanted to dissolve those waste materials, hypothetically, in water so as to reach the maximum level of contamination allowed by law, you would need twice all the fresh water in the entire world. And that's simply a way of dramatizing how toxic this material is and why it's so important to keep it out of the environment. Even if you kept 99% of this material safely stored and only allowed 1% to release, it would be a catastrophe. You can't allow it to release. Here in Canada, we did a report in 1978 also called A Race Against Time. It was about nuclear power in Ontario. And they published a graph showing that the waste from one of our reactors after just 1 year of cooling would be, if you ask the question, how much water would you need to dissolve that material to the maximum levels of contamination allowed by law? It's about equivalent to the volume of Lake Superior. Now, that's only 1 year from one reactor. If you take 20 reactors operating for 30 years, you'd need 600 Lake Superiors. We don't have 600 Lake Superiors. That's why this problem is unparalleled. It's not a problem that can be compared with any other kind of waste.
So what are your thoughts on something like storing it deep in the ground in the earth, which obviously doesn't sound like it's gone that well, like a Yucca Mountain, which obviously that one, for political reasons, will never happen, or storing it above ground in what are called casks. Some are thin-walled, some are thick-walled, and they're kept in water from what I understand.
Well, it's important to understand what we're talking about, what these wastes are. And by the way, even if they're cooled for 70 years, these wastes are so hot, they have to be cooled for several years, first of all, in a pool of water. It's called a spent fuel bay. Then they can be put into those dry storage casks you're talking about. But that's only after several years of coming out of the reactor. In the meantime, they're much more vulnerable to attack or catastrophe from earthquakes, tornadoes, warfare, anything of that sort. When they're in the dry cask, the question is, how secure are those casks? And there is a complaint that these casks should be much thicker than they are. Here in Canada, we have casks which weigh 60 tons empty to hold only 10 tons of waste fuel. So you have a 60-ton cask with 10 tons of waste inside it. Now, imagine if you had a refrigerator that required a package that was 6 times larger than the refrigerator. It's astonishing. And the reason why is because of not only the penetrating radiation, which is called the gamma radiation and neutron radiation. These are penetrating, and you can't completely stop that radiation. But there's also the problem of internal contamination, which is really the long-term problem. Once you store this waste underground for a period of time, It's not the external radiation that's the important thing. The important thing is getting this stuff into the food chain, getting it into the water we drink, into the food we eat. And then it becomes an internal emitter, and you actually incorporate it into your body. And each one of these radioactive materials has a different pathway through the environment and a different pathway through the human body. For example, radioactive iodine, which doesn't really exist in nature, but it's produced inside nuclear reactors. In nature, iodine is non-radioactive. Also, cesium is non-radioactive. Strontium is non-radioactive. These are naturally occurring non-radioactive materials. But the nuclear reactor makes radioactive varieties of these materials. What are those? They're exactly the same as the non-radioactive variety. They behave the same way. They go to the same organs. They travel through the environment in the same way. The difference is that the atoms are unstable and they disintegrate. And when the atoms disintegrate, they give off a kind of a subatomic shrapnel. And that shrapnel damages living cells. And once the living cells are damaged, they can develop a small, very small percentage of them will develop into cancers. And some of them may develop into genetic defects. For example, it could damage the sperms and eggs in a female or a male. And then that gets transmitted to future generations. So this is why it's so important to keep these materials out of the environment. Once the radioactive varieties mix in with the non-radioactive varieties, you can no longer separate them. So if you keep them separate from the outset, you're kind of safe. So there might be a little bit of leakage, but hopefully you keep it to an absolute minimum. But if there was a massive dispersal of this material into the environment, you could no longer separate that material, the radioactive from the non-radioactive, and the whole planet would be that much less livable.
And those casks we were mentioning a few moments ago, how
Yeah.
thick are the walls? Do you know? Because it sounds like
Well, in the United States, they're much thinner than they are here in Canada, and they're much thinner than they are in Germany. And I think the reason for that is obviously when you have profit-making companies, they want to maximize the bottom line, and so they don't want to spend money needlessly. If they can get away with using a thinner cask, then they will do so. The other thing is that they think it's only temporary. It was believed in the early days that they would solve this problem fairly quickly, that they would have a complete solution to the problem of the nuclear waste. And so they didn't even bother telling people about it. They said it's not going to really be a problem because we, the nuclear scientists, are going to look after it. Unfortunately, that's not been the case. To this day, we do not have a repository operating anywhere in the world for the safe storage of high-level radioactive waste. So these are these temporary storages. And by the way, I noticed in that bill that you referred to, the Wyoming bill, it says that one of the conditions is that this be temporary. Well, what does temporary mean? Does it mean 5 years? Does it mean 5,000 years? Does it mean 5 million years? Temporary is a very ambiguous word. It has no legal meaning.
It's a very good point. And speaking of the thickness of the casks, one of the areas that has them and has this waste is in Southern California, San Onofre. I know you're familiar with it. What are your thoughts on the situation there? Obviously, the nuclear reactor is no longer operating, but they've got that waste not very far from the ocean, and clearly that something needs to be done with that. What are your thoughts?
It's very irresponsible, but it's based on a kind of a lie that the industry perpetrated at the outset, that this is essentially clean energy. And by the way, they're still using that same lie today in selling small modular reactors. The idea, the natrium reactor, they call it clean. It's not clean. It produces exactly the same kind of radioactive waste that all other reactors produce, and it is extremely toxic. And what's more, with the natrium reactor, for example, that is being proposed for Wyoming, they will be producing radioactive waste, which is far more radioactive than the waste we currently have. Far more radioactive because the uranium-235, which is that's the kind that fissions. There's only one kind of uranium that fissions. It's called uranium-235, and it's very, very concentrated in the natrium reactor. The more concentrated the uranium is, the more abundant are the fission products, the broken pieces of uranium atoms. And so the waste from that reactor will be more radioactive per kilogram than any other commercial reactor operating anywhere in the world at the present time. And what's more, they intend to reprocess that waste. What that means is They call it recycling. But the only way you can recycle this waste is to take the fuel assembly, which is solid. It's a solid metallic fuel assembly. They have to actually destroy the fuel assembly in order to get at the material inside, which is called plutonium, that they want to use as further fuel for further iterations of the nuclear reactors running. When they run the reactor again, they want to have more fuel that they retrieve from the spent fuel. But in order to do that, they have to open up the spent fuel and release all of the fission products out of the spent fuel. And many of those end up in the environment. For example, where they have reprocessing in the world, they have at Hanford, Washington, they did reprocessing of spent fuel to get the plutonium out for bombs, for nuclear weapons. And the cost of cleanup at Hanford is estimated by the Government Accounting Office as being between $300 billion and $640 billion. And that's a 2023 estimate by the U.S. General Accounting Office. In England, they have a similar situation up in northern England. It's called Sellafield. They also reprocessed, they have to destroy the bundles in order to get at the plutonium. And the cleanup costs there are extremely high as well, and they keep escalating. So these are the most contaminated sites on Earth, are the sites where they did the reprocessing of spent fuel. Now, technology has improved. They have much better technology nowadays. They have much better controls in place. It's still an awesome challenge. And how do you manage all that radioactive waste? The worst thing about the radioactive waste is sooner or later, the industry wants to abandon this waste. And once you abandon it, who's looking after it anymore? Nobody's looking after it. And once you abandon it underground, you can have leakage. And this is what happened in Germany, for example. They put waste into 30 different underground chambers at a place called Assa 2, a salt mine. And that waste was found in the 1990s to be leaking into the groundwater. And they have analyzed it. And the more they investigate, the worse it becomes. Now in 2010, that's 15 years ago, they decided that the only solution is to get the waste out of that repository. They're going to have to send men down into the repository to get the waste out, which is far more dangerous than it was putting it in there in the first place. Because now the barrels have all rusted and they're no longer solid like they were to start with. But they are now saying that they're going to have to spend up to $5 billion, and it'll take over 30 years to get that waste out of the repository. And that will be the end of that particular experiment. Once they get the waste back up on the surface, they have no other idea as to where to put it. So it becomes a legacy for future generations. And what the industry and the government are both basically telling us is that if we put this waste underground, we can then tiptoe away and say, there, job done, mission accomplished. But the problem is, maybe the job isn't done. Maybe that stuff is going to find its way back to the surface. Nature has a way of recycling stuff. And if that stuff comes back to the surface, then you have a problem, and there's no plan to retrieve it. So what's happened in Europe is they've now, since the German experience, they have now said, you know what? We can no longer think about putting it down there permanently. We have to think about it as a temporary thing. And it may be there for hundreds of years, but we have to have a plan for getting it back out again if we have to, because that's what they're doing right now with the Assa 2 repository.
Wow. So let me ask you this. If you lived in Wyoming or were a Wyoming lawmaker, what questions would you be asking knowing this bill is coming before you?
Well, I would be asking the question whether people are well informed, whether the decision makers themselves are well informed, and if their information comes only from the industry and is pitched in such a way as to make it sound harmless, or whether they're getting a wide range of information from knowledgeable people. There is, for example, U.S. Academy of Sciences. You know, the U.S. Academy of Sciences was set up, the National Academy of Sciences, to advise Congress and the president on scientific matters. And just 2 years ago, they had a panel on the subject of advanced reactors, such as the natrium, and the problems associated with those reactors. And that panel came up with some pretty negative comments about the push to continue producing more nuclear waste, because that's what we're really doing. We're saying that rather than using wind and solar and efficiency as our main goals to achieve net zero carbon emissions, we're using the dirtiest technology on Earth in terms of waste production. It's clean in operation only because they don't allow that waste to escape. Some of it does, and it really does give off emissions regularly into the water and the environment, but that's only a trickle compared with what's inside. So here's the pitch. 30 years ago, I mean, excuse me, 80 years ago, nuclear power was presented as a clean energy source, a problem-free energy source. I believed it when I was in high school because that's what I was told. By the time I graduated from university, I found that that's not really true. There's serious problems, and you can't just brush them under the rug. You've got to really seriously face them. It costs tens of billions of dollars to try and deal with it, and even then, you can't be sure that it is properly dealt with. The question is, why should we keep on adding to that radioactive legacy when we have other forms of energy which produce no such waste and which do not give any toxic legacy for future generations? Surely our best bet is to invest in the things that are cheapest, safest, and fastest to reduce carbon emissions. And there's no doubt that these are renewables. If you go to Wall Street, you find that the firm called Lazard, which advises investors as to energy choices, they point out that solar with storage and wind with storage are both much cheaper than nuclear. In fact, the highest estimated cost of wind and solar with storage, the highest estimated cost of those is smaller, significantly smaller than the lowest estimated cost of nuclear. So why are we expending money on the most expensive and the slowest to deploy? To deploy nuclear, it's going to take the better part of a decade at least, and maybe longer. Whereas wind and solar, they can be put up in a season or two. And also, we know that wind and solar work. We've got many examples around the world. It's working very well, and the price keeps dropping. Whereas with nuclear, the price keeps going up, and we don't know for sure that these new reactor designs are going to work. There are many examples. For example, let's take the Natrium reactor in Wyoming. It's a sodium-cooled reactor. Well, you know what? They had a sodium-cooled reactor in Detroit called Fermi 1. It had a partial meltdown and was shut down without producing any useful electricity. They had a huge sodium-cooled reactor in France called the Super Phoenix. It never worked properly, and they shut it down. It was a big disappointment to the French because they were banking on these. In Germany, they built a sodium-cooled reactor, and they decided after it was built, completely built, they decided not to operate it because to operate it would pose too much risk and too much cost. They turned it into an amusement park, and they now use the reactor building as a kind of a swing apparatus for people to take thrilling rides around inside that reactor. And why is this the case? Well, the reason why is because sodium itself is a liquid metal that burns spontaneously on contact with air or water. And they have sodium fires. In Japan, they had a sodium-cooled reactor, which turned out to be, they never were able to get it operating properly after many, many years of effort. So we've had many examples of these sodium-cooled reactors. Now, Bill Gates is a smart guy, but he's not God, and he can't overrule the laws of physics. And the laws of physics are sodium burns on contact with water or air, and that nuclear waste is indestructible and a problem for millions of years. Those two facts, combined with the cost, combined with the slowness, these things must be taken into consideration. All of these facts have to be before the decision makers. If the decision makers are being hoodwinked into thinking this is a slam dunk, then that's a very bad basis for making decisions.
Let's talk for a moment, if we could, about the small modular reactors like the one being built right now in Wyoming. In terms of the volume of spent nuclear fuel, How does that compare for that type reactor versus what we're used to, the bigger size?
It's a lot smaller. The volume is much, much smaller, but the radioactivity is undiminished. It's the radioactivity is the problem, not the volume. The volume is not the problem. If you crowd all the radioactivity into a much smaller volume, then you have a much more radioactive problem in a smaller volume. The interesting thing is that when you put an underground repository in, it's not the volume of the waste that matters. It's the heat generated by the waste. And the heat generated by the waste depends only upon the radioactivity. So what they have to do is they have to space out these fuel assemblies so that the temperature between the fuel assemblies is not more than 100 degrees Celsius. The reason for that is they don't want the water underground to boil. If the water starts boiling, then you have steam, and that steam pressure can push the radioactivity back to the surface. So they want to prevent steam from forming, and that means they have to space it out. Now, this fuel from the natrium reactor, although it's much smaller in volume, it's equally hot. And so when you put it underground, you have to space it out. You do not diminish the volume of the repository, only marginally. It might be 10% smaller, but certainly not half the size or a third of the size. And in the meantime, you've created a whole bunch of other problems because you've created other waste streams, including contaminated equipment, including the stuff that you inevitably give off into the atmosphere during the destruction of the fuel bundles to get the plutonium out. So you create further problems that weren't there before. And you're actually compounding the problem rather than solving it. Now, again, when the nuclear industry talks about the small volume of the waste, they are being deceptive. They're telling the truth, but in a way so as to deceive, because they're implying that the problem has been made a lot more manageable. And that's not true. It's been made more manageable in terms of size. That means you don't need as large, the trucks don't have to be as large, let's say, but the shielding around those trucks has to be far greater because you're carrying a far more radioactive load. And it's not the actual size of the waste, it's the size of the protection you need to keep those wastes contained.
Understood. So let me throw this last question at you. Let's go back to 1975, okay? And you're given an opportunity, knowing what you know right now, to talk to communities, countries, scientific experts about the nuclear industry. What do you say?
I would say that it's better to follow the general rule of investing. The general rule of investing is you invest in things which cost less, which are faster to get returns. The thing about renewables, not only are they faster to deploy, but you also, the payback time is much faster. Wind power typically pays itself off in less than a year. That means you've recovered your investment and you can reinvest that money in more windmills, for example. On the other hand, with nuclear, you don't start making any money. It doesn't, first of all, you have to wait till it's built and operating. That may take 10 years or less. Then you have to wait about the same amount of time for it to pay itself off. And by that time, you're already 2 decades into the climate crisis. And what's more, you can't even spend all that money building more reactors because you have to put a large chunk of it aside for handling the waste and for handling what's called the decommissioning, which is the radioactive demolition of the reactor itself, which even the building becomes radioactive, the concrete and the steel. You know what? The stainless steel inside the core area of a nuclear reactor can never be reused for civilian use. It has to be buried also as radioactive waste because it has become too dangerous for civilian use. So it just does not seem to be a good investment. And nowadays, when one looks at the prognostications, for example, the International Energy Agency has stated that in the next 10 years, 90% worldwide of all the electricity generating capacity to be installed is going to be renewable. And another thing they said is that, well, this is something you can find from even from the Nuclear Energy Institute. They point out that the market share of nuclear worldwide has sharply declined from 17% 25 years ago to 9% today. So it's been on a sharp decline, and it's going to continue to decline. I think we're barking up the wrong tree.
Mhm. Okay. Well, Gordon, is there anything that I'm not asking you that you'd like to mention about this?
I would like to mention a very serious problem, which I also mentioned in my debate with Edward Teller those many years ago, and that is the nuclear weapons concerns. It turns out that nuclear reactors, while producing energy, they also produce the stuff that you need to make a lot of atomic bombs, and that's called plutonium. In fact, the first reactors were built solely for that purpose. If we sell reactors around the world, remember, we're not just talking about North America, we're talking about the entire world. If we start selling reactors around the world, it means every country in the world is going to have access to their own stash of plutonium. That means they have their own nuclear weapons capability. And that means you have a world where any conflict anywhere in the world can turn into a nuclear war. That's a very sobering thought. And I mean, it's bad enough with the superpowers threatening each other, as Putin, has been lately threatening to use nuclear weapons if he's pushed too much. And also the attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which would cause a really catastrophic release, as even Mr. Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, has been very clear in his warnings about that. But the nuclear weapons challenge is even greater. And I think the nuclear weapons challenge is if anything, equally dangerous as climate change, if not more so. Because, with nuclear weapons, it really is sobering to think that we have the capability to eliminate human civilization from the face of the earth in a matter of hours.
Yeah,
Even one
disturbing.
Trident submarine, many people don't know this, even one Trident submarine with all its nuclear warheads on board has enough nuclear ammunition and targeting capabilities to destroy every major city in the Northern Hemisphere. Just one submarine alone.
Wow. It really is a lot to think about. And you really
So
painted an
the question
interesting
is, if
picture.
we want a sustainable planet, we should really think about the long term and not just the short term. And even in the short term, we've got better choices.
Yeah, Dr. Gordon Edwards, I really appreciate your time. Folks out there, if you want to learn more about what's going on around Wyoming, just go to wyliberty.org. Doc, thanks so much. I really appreciate your time today.
No problem. And if people want to check our website, it's the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. It's a very simple login. It's www.ccnr.org.
Awesome. Thank you, Doc.
Bye-bye.